And I'm back with part 3 of my Iplehouse Marien inspired outfit. So I have a lot of pattern pieces. I'm not going to go through each one, but you can see me putting them aside one by one. So my first step is going to be taking my back side fabric and my back center fabric and pinning them together. So I have 2 back side pieces and 1 center piece, and then the same for the lining. So I'm pinning the sides to the side of the center piece, starting from the top and going to the bottom, making sure everything lines up. Then I'm going to repeat it for the other side with my fabric as well as my lining, and then sew. It's a good idea to press the seams at this time. I didn't because I was going to do it a bit later. Now I'm going to take my back top fabric or shoulder fabric and pin it to my fabric and my lining, good side to good side, making sure I pin the seam allowances from my previous seams into the direction I want, then sew. And once again you can press the seams. I'm keeping them to press the seams later. Next I'm going to take my front side pieces and I'm going to pin and sew the darts. I fold my fabric along the dart and pin, and then I'm going to sew. After that, I'm going to be taking my front center pieces and then sewing them to my front side pieces. Making sure to pin the fabric nicely around the curved edge. And usually in spots like this, when I sew, I put the flatter side on the bottom and the more folded side on the top. Now we have 2 front pieces and a back piece for both the fabric and the lining. So I'm going to take my front pieces and pin them to the shoulders to the back piece, good side to good side, and the same for my lining, and sew. So now I have my torso piece for my fabric and my lining. Next up I'm going to add a decoration to my sleeve cuffs, pockets and side bottom collar pieces. So I have a guide on my paper pattern for where I want my ribbons to go, and then I put it in place, pin it and cut off the excess and continue on. I don't finish off the edges properly at this time because I am going to gluing on buttons at the later stage, and the glue is going to keep them from fraying. And these decorative pieces are only going on the fabric and not on the lining. Next, the pockets. For this one I'm not cutting small pieces, but I'm folding my ribbon instead, so that I have a pretty, it has a different effect. And then similar to my sleeve cuffs, I'm doing the same for my bottom collar pieces. and then sew it. I sew it on both sides with white stitching for a bit more decoration. So next I'm going to take my nice sleeve cuff and pin it to my lining, and my lining sleeve cuff to my fabric. Why? Because this is a folded over cuff, so if you don't do it this way and you fold it over, the decoration is going to be on the inside or hidden. So I sew them, and I also sew a stitch on the edge for later when I have to use a hidden stitch to sew them, finish them off. Next I'm going to add my lining to my fabric pieces of my collar, going around the short side and the outer side. And while turning them inside out, I cut the sharp corners so that they can turn inside out more easily and more neatly. You can see me trying to do it with a pin, but the pin is not the best choice since it tends to go through the fabric. And then I pin my sleeve, my collars in place, and then I add a decorative gold stitch to the collar and the cuffs. It's not technically gold, but more of a brown, goldish brown. Next I'm going to do my top collar. First I took some silver ribbon and made a gathering stitch, and then I gathered the ruffle on the black fabric. The black fabric is going to be the visible part of the fabric. So after adding the ruffle, I sew, and then I'm going to sew my white lining piece on top, making sure everything is neatly in place. Since the ruffle can be a bit bulky. And I sew along the three edges, and then cut the corners to turn them inside out properly. And then I pin them so that I can press the seams nicely. Next I'm going to add the lining to my pockets, going around the bottom three edges, pinning the lining to the fabric, good side to good side, and then sewing. And then once again cutting the corners so I can turn them inside out properly. And after that I'm going to press all the seams. So now everything's nice, neat and flat. Next step, I'm going to add my sleeves to my torso piece. Lining to lining and fabric to fabric, and good side to good side. I start from one edge, going to the other side, and pinning all my seam allowances where I want them. Sometimes I'm doing one side and then other side, and then the first side again until I reach the other point, or until I reach each other. And in some patterns I start at the center of the sleeve and the shoulder seam. Anyway, repeat, and now the sleeves are onto the body piece. Next, I'm going to close up the side seams. Pinning good side to good side together. Starting from the sleeves, then the armpit, making sure my seam allowance is in the direction I want. And then going to the side. And then I do that for the other side, and then for the other piece of fabric. So it's the same for my fabric and my lining. So I only turn my fabric inside out, because my lining is going to be technically inside out, inside my fabric. And I use my pattern as a guide, so I know where my pockets are, and I pin them and sew them in place from the decorative side to the top, and I'm only pinning the one side. And after sewing that, I'm going to hand sew the fold over the pocket so that the decorative side is on top, and sew the bottom edge in place so that it stays in place, since it's not a functional pocket. Then I pierce the seams. Next, I'm going to add the top collar piece. The best way to do it is start from the sides and go to the center, or start from the center and go outwards to the sides. And now I'm adding my bottom collar pieces and comparing with my pattern to know exactly where I want them, since they don't exactly meet up with the top collar piece. So I pin them in place, making sure everything lines up, and then sew. And in this case, I'm pinning the bad side to the good side, the bad side of the collar piece to the good side of the fabric. So after sewing that in place, I'm going to start pinning my lining. So I'm going to pin my lining all around, making sure all the seams line up and everything is where it's supposed to be. Making sure everything is in place and my seam allowances in the directions I want them. I am going to naturally leave a spot unpinned and unsewn so I can turn the whole thing inside out, and I'm going to do that on one of the front side pieces or positions, mainly because it's easier to sew on or use an invisible stitch on a straight edge. So after sewing everything, I sew another piece in the center back and then cut. Basically I sew a rectangle and then cut between the rectangles, so my back center piece can have that, I don't know what you call it, that open piece. That makes it look fancier. Anyway, now I'm turning everything inside out. It's quite a lot of fabric to get through a smaller hole. And as I'm turning everything inside out, I'm going to pin parts in place so that I can press the seams neatly later. Especially around edges and corners. But before I'm going to do that, I am going to sew up the hole I left to turn everything inside out, as well as my sleeve cuffs. And so I'm shoving my sleeve lining into my sleeve fabric, and I'm turning those stitched edges into the space between the fabric and the lining to finish that up, to help me as a guide for my ladder stitch to finish them up. And naturally I pin them in place to hold them like that for now. Now, like I said, for that open space which we used to turn the fabric inside out, I am going to use a hidden stitch or invisible stitch or ladder stitch, whichever you call it, to sew it up. Sorry for the background noise. After sewing that up, I go to the sleeves and do the same, being careful not to let my thread get hooked around all of the pins. And then I'm going to repeat for the other sleeve. And then we're pretty much done. After pressing all the seams nice and neat, I'm going to add decorations in the form of buttons and so on and so forth. What I didn't show, unfortunately, because the footage is lost, is how I made the hat. If you're interested, I can do a separate video remaking one to show you. And also what I didn't show is the belt, which is 2 pieces of vinyl sewn together with a layer of lace sewn on top and snaps to hold it in place at the back. My mannequin doesn't have a head, so it is on my SD doll, my little and a complete outfit with chains and buttons and all. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time. Bye.